Today is part 2 of our theme development series. Last time we took a 1-measure motif, turned it into a 4-bar phrase, and then further expanded it into a full 1-minute cue for orchestra. Now last time I mentioned that this would be a great melody for jazz big band, and it would be a very valid way to go. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We'll look at things like sax solo writing and how I've harmonized this to give it that classic big band sound. All right, let's take a look. Let's start by looking at our original 4-bar melody. It started with this initial kernel, this 1-bar motif that we turned into the 4-bar phrase. It was originally in F minor. I've turned it into G minor here for this piece. And these notes were played as straight eighth notes. Let me just play this for you. So now let's look at what I've done to conform this melody into a jazz sound. To make it swing a little bit more, I've changed the rhythm slightly. I've used the same notes. We have G, B flat, F sharp, G. Here we have those same notes, G, B flat, F sharp, G, but I put them as all eighth notes, and these are swing eighth notes. This is the same thing in measure 2, where we have 2 eighth notes and 2 quarter notes, and I've just changed them into 4 eighth notes. This third measure is a little bit different. We have the same shape, but the notes are slightly different just because I want to really lean on this blue note, the D flat. So we're using a G minor blues scale, which is this: G, B flat, C, D flat, D, and F. And I really want to accentuate that D flat, so I'm leaning into it here on this measure. And then we end the same way on this D note. Now let's listen to just these first 4 bars, but with our alto sax playing the melody in a swing style. You can hear how the character of this theme has totally changed. Just with a few small tweaks to the rhythm and a little bit to the melody, we've transformed our original idea into something entirely new. We've developed a new use for this theme. All right, let's look at the second half of this 8-bar melody and see how I've come up with that. Looking at the second half of our 8-bar phrase, we're using the same type of rhythms that we used from the beginning, these groups of 4 eighth notes starting on beat 2. Then we have a little bit of a flourish here on the second to the last bar of this 8-bar phrase. And we end on our original motif, that initial idea of G, B flat, F sharp, G. The only difference here is that we're starting it on beat 1 instead of beat 2. All right, let's listen to the full 8-measure phrase, and then we'll talk about the chords that I'll be using to harmonize this. To harmonize the melody, I started with the 1 chord, this G minor 6. Now the reason I didn't use a G minor 7 is for 2 reasons. First of all, the root, the G, is in the melody, and using the G minor 6 is going to help me later on when I'm voicing these saxophones in the sax soli. Also, there's an F sharp in the melody, and that F sharp is part of the melodic minor scale, which is what this G minor 6 uses as a chord scale. So this just turned out to be a much stronger choice using the G minor 6. Next, I looked at this D7 chord, and this is the same chord we used in our last harmonization of the melody. The only difference here is that I've added the tensions sharp 9 and flat 5, and that gives the chord a little bit of a sense of mystery and adds some interest to the sound. To fill in these 2 previous chords, I used a staple of jazz, a 2-5. So I used the 2 of 5 and the 5 of 5. This is actually the sub 5 of 5 because it's a tritone substitution. So using secondary dominants and 2 5s are really the backbone of jazz harmony, and that's why that seems to fit here so well. Over the next two measures, I used a G minor line cliche. We've talked about these before. They're a great way to get mileage out of a single chord that sits here for two measures without it feeling static. That stepwise chromatic bass line adds a lot of movement. And finally here, I used, again, the sub 5 of 5 and the 5 chord going back to 1. Now let's move on to a part of the process that I find really fun, and that's filling in the notes of our sax soli. It's kind of like doing a creative puzzle. It's very relaxing for me, so I enjoy this. Let's look at the methods that I use to write this sax soli. There are a few things to think about as we work on this. First of all of the players will be playing in concerted rhythm, meaning that all of the parts will have exactly the same rhythm. They'll also be moving all in the same direction, so if the melody is moving upward, all of the other parts will also be moving upward. Another consideration is how much space to leave between the alto sax 1 on the top or lead and the alto sax 2. I like to have at least a minor third between the melody and this second voice. That way this voice can really stand out and be heard. So let's start voicing this downward from the top. We'll be using a technique called close voicing, a very classic sound in big band writing, and that will keep all of the notes in each of our voicing within one octave. We'll harmonize this first note in the melody, the G, which is a chord tone, with notes from our G minor 6 chord, and those notes are G, B flat, D, and E. So the next closest note below our G would be an E, and that fits our idea of keeping a minor third between alto 1 and alto 2. Our next closest note would be the D in tenor sax 1, and our next closest note would be the B flat in tenor sax 2. And there's our entire G minor 6 chord. Now, it's also very common to double the melody an octave lower in the baritone sax. I'm not going to do that in these first four measures because I'll be using the same section later on, and the baritone sax is going to be playing a solo that might hold over into this section. So I'm going to leave them out for the first four bars of this sax soli. We'll voice the next note in our melody, which is a B flat, also a chord tone, and we'll do it in exactly the same way, where we'll pick notes from that G minor 6 that are as close as we can get to the B flat and still retain that minor third between the alto sax 1 and alto sax 2. So we have a B flat in the melody, and we can put the G, which is our next lowest note, and that works with our idea of having at least a minor third here. And then we can go down to the tenor 1, and our next closest note would be the E natural. And then we can go down to the tenor sax 2, and our closest note would be the D natural. And you can see that all of these instruments are moving in the same direction upward. Not all by the same interval, but all in the same direction. The next note, the F sharp, is not a chord tone, so I'll be skipping that note for now. We're going to handle that a little bit differently. Let's move on to this last G in this four-note grouping. And you can see it's the same note as the first note of our four-note grouping, so I'm going to use exactly the same notes to harmonize it. So we'll put an E here, we'll put a D here, and we'll put our B flat here. Now let's look at what we can do with this F sharp. Since this F sharp is not a chord tone, we're going to look at what note it's targeting. So in our melody, the next note is a G natural. And on that G natural, we've put our one chord, our G minor 6. So we could pick a chord that would target that G minor 6. The 5 chord of G minor is D7, and it would have that F sharp in it. So we could try a D dominant 7 chord here. The notes in that are D, F sharp, A, and C. So let's see if that will work. Our next lowest note here would be the D, and then we could go down to the C, and then finally we could go down to the A. And yes, that does work. It follows all our rules. We're going downward, then upward. So here it's downward, then upward, downward, then upward, downward, then upward. So this should work very nicely. Let's listen to just those first four notes. Yeah, that works great. It's got that classic sax solo sound. Now, there's something else we could do on that F sharp, that non-chord tone. Right now we have this D7 sound. Starting from the top, we have F sharp, D, C, and A. And that's got a really strong pull back to our G minor 6. But if we were to change just one note in that voicing, take this D and move it up to an E flat, we would have this, an A diminished 7. Now, diminished chords are built symmetrically. They're all in minor thirds. So if we put the F sharp, our lead note, down at the bottom, we get F sharp diminished 7. So that would be the 7 diminished 7 of 1. And a little trick with diminished chords is if you put another note a third below, a major third below the bottom, you get this, a D7 flat 9. So we're right back to that D7 with the flat 9, which is something we would use here in this minor key. So that's why it's such a powerful pull back to that G minor 6. And that's why these passing diminished chords often work. So I'm going to try that. I'm going to move this D here up to an E flat. And let's hear that. It should have a little bit more interest. That works too. And granted, with everybody playing, it's a fairly subtle difference. But for alto sax too, it gives them a hipper line to play. Instead of with the D, it's, now they have, it's a little bit nicer. All right, let's move into measure 2 and harmonize this with the same method. Looking at the first two notes of our melody in bar 2, we can see they're the same as the first two notes of the melody in bar 1, although we have now a different chord here, an E minor 7 flat 5. The interesting thing about this E minor 7 flat 5 is it has exactly the same notes as our G minor 6. Now we just have E in the bass, that's the difference. So we should be able to use these exact same voicings on these first two notes on these first two notes. So I'm going to try that. I'm just going to copy these and paste them. Having consistency in your voicings can be a good thing, and I think especially here where we're going to be hearing the same voicing as the first measure, but now over a different bass note. All right, let's look at the next note in our melody. Actually, let's look at the next two notes, because neither one of those is a chord tone of our E minor 7 flat 5. If this second note, the C, was a chord tone, then we could harmonize it with notes from the E minor 7 flat 5 and then just use some sort of technique to move a half step like chromatic planing or some sort of passing diminished chord to get us there. But it isn't a chord tone, so we're going to have to handle this with a little bit of care. I remember when I was choosing this chord here, I did consider this, but I think there is a way around this. And the E minor 7 flat 5, that half diminished chord, one of the chord scales that can be used on this chord is called the Locrian natural 6. So I'm just going to get a piano sound up here. That sounds like this. E Locrian natural 6 would be E, F, G, A, B flat, and now a C sharp or D flat that we have in the melody, that's enharmonically the same thing, and D. That would be our Locrian natural 6 scale. Now that doesn't have our C natural, but another scale that you can use on this E minor 7 flat 5 is the Locrian natural 2. And that sounds like this. E, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C, D. So I'm going to use those two scales to pick my tensions. Let's see how I harmonize this. Under the D flat, I think I'm going to just walk down the rest of that E minor 7 flat 5 chord with that natural 6 on top. So I'll put a B flat here, we'll put a G here, and we'll put an E here. And then we have to decide what to do with this C. Well, looking at that voicing I just put in there, that's an E diminished 7. So maybe I'll try to make this a chord too. I'm going to go down that B flat, I'm going to go down a half step to an A. That's an available tension. I'm going to go from the G down to an F sharp, and that F sharp would come from our E Locrian natural 2. And then I'm going to go to, I'm just going to put a D here. And then that would make that a D7 voicing. But all those notes should work with our E minor 7 flat 5 while using that Locrian natural 2 scale. Let's listen to all of this and see what it sounds like. I'll leave in the bass and piano so we can hear it over that harmony. Okay, that sounds great. I probably overthought that a little bit. I could have just considered the raised 6th degree and the raised 2nd degree as tensions that were available to me, but I like to know where things come from. Let's move on to the next measure and start with this high note in the alto, this G. This note is fairly high in the alto saxophone's range. It's probably the highest note I would ever want to write for a melody like this. So to keep all of the other saxophones in a good and reasonable range for them, I'm going to use a technique called drop 2 here. And I'll first voice this as a close voicing, just as we have been, and then we'll convert it to a drop 2. I'm going to do this quickly and we'll come back and look at that. I've finished these voicings using the same method that we've been using, the close voicing method, and now I'm going to take this second line and drop it down an octave. That's the drop 2, and that'll give us a better spread between the voices. You can see here that this tenor one, this D flat's getting up a little bit high too, and I don't want that. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this voice, delete it, move these two voices up. Now paste into tenor 2 what was our alto 2 sax part and drop it down an octave. And now we have our drop 2 voicing. Let's take a listen to this. That's coming along very nicely. It's got the sound that I'm after. I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of the piece, adding in the trumpets and trombones, and then we'll come back and take a listen to the whole thing. I've finished the piece, The Jazz Thief, and there are a few things to listen for. I've added this articulation in the saxophones, and it's a scoop, so they scoop up to their note. In bar 4, the baritone sax enters and is doubling the melody 2 octaves lower, where usually it would be 1 octave lower, so that's an interesting sound. Later on, there's a big hit in the brass here, and we've got our lead trumpet way up on a high F, and so on a B-flat trumpet, that would be a high G, a very high note. But for a lead trumpet player and a big band, no problem. They'll be able to do that. Then after that, I have a sax solo in the bari sax, and he's playing over the minor blues changes. And then we return to our A section with a little stinger on the end. So I hope this was an interesting thing to see how you could take a melody and use it in such a different way. If you haven't seen the first episode, go back and watch it. But we've taken this little kernel, expanded it out into a 4-bar phrase and an 8-bar phrase, written a cue in kind of a contemporary film scoring sound, and now we've used it in this big band jazz style. Thank you for all following along. Thanks for all the nice comments I've been getting, and I'll see you all next time. Now, the Jazz Thief.